There's a long-standing narrative of Jesus as a carpenter. And so many people growing up heard this story of Jesus being a carpenter. Many people believe that they read that Jesus was a carpenter in Scripture. But if you do a careful reading of Scripture, you will see that it does not say definitively that Jesus was a carpenter. One of the things that has happened with Scripture is that there have been translation issues. And so going from one language to the other, and in some instances, going through multiple languages. There are also issues with editing to come up with these various versions of Scripture. And what comes out, if you go along with this Jesus as a carpenter narrative, is Jesus is painted very symbolically like Jacob. And so if you go along with this carpenter narrative, Jesus is presented as a deceiver, Jesus is presented as a gatekeeper, Jesus is presented as a craft man or man of the craft, and ultimately Jesus is presented, according to this erroneous narrative, as a Rob Mog. Not only a Rob Mog, but maybe the robbest of the Mogs. Okay. And so we're going to deconstruct this so you can see how this came about and the implications of this carpenter narrative. Now, a number of people rely on generative AI to give them answers to questions, and sometimes generative AI might be correct. In this particular instance, however, generative AI is incorrect. And so, with respect to the question of whether Jesus was a carpenter, generative AI offers yes, Jesus was a carpenter before he began his ministry. Okay. It indicates the Bible refers to Jesus as, in quotes, the carpenter in Mark 6:3 and as the carpenter's son in Matthew 13:55. We're going to carefully look at these two verses so that you can see how things might have gone in a wrong direction. First of all, this is the word for carpenter in the Greek. And so, therefore, if there was going to be a reference to Jesus being a carpenter, this is the word that should have been used. And so, it's a word that's used for a carpenter or a woodworker. However, this is not the word that was used. So you have xylurgos in the Greek for carpenter, and then in the Hebrew, you have nagar as the word for a carpenter. Neither of these words are used in these references to Jesus being a carpenter. And here you can see that word used again for carpenter, joiner, and cabinet maker. However, again, this is not used in reference to Jesus. You don't see it in Scripture. It's not there. There is another term that's used that creates a bit of confusion. It is, however, noted that there is a commonality between the word that is actually used in the Greek and this construct of carpenter. And in the Latin, you see that carpenter is related to the construct of artifacts and maker. Now let's look at this entry that is at the heart of some significant confusion here. So we are looking at the KJV, and we are going to the book of Matthew, and the chapter is 13 and the verse is 55. And the sentence starts off, "Is not this the carpenter's son?" And there's a question mark. Of course, there was not a question mark originally, but we have this negation language that's also included in this question. And so this is not actually stating that, one, Joseph is actually a carpenter, and it's also not stating that Jesus is the son of the carpenter. I know it might look like that, but that's not what's going on here. And so this is a question. And we can also see a similar construction again in the KJV, looking at Mark 6:3. And it indicates here, is not this the carpenter, the son of Mary, the brother of James and Joseph, and of Judah and Simon? And so again, this is not actually stating that Jesus was a carpenter. It's asking the question of whether this person is a carpenter and also the son of Mary and the brother of the other entities. And so this is important to keep in mind because, again, this is a question and there's also a negation in there. And here you can see the language pulled out for clarity. And so again, it indicates, is not this the carpenter's son? And then, is not this the carpenter, the son of Mary? Now, part of the confusion seems to be about translation, but it's also likely that part of the confusion is about editing, and also the failure of many individuals to actually do the exegesis of this to come away with what exactly is being stated. Now, while it has been assumed that Jesus was a carpenter, we don't have a direct statement from the entity known as Jesus that he was a carpenter. We also don't have a direct statement from anyone else asserting definitively that the entity known as Jesus was a carpenter. We also don't have a definitive statement relating to the actual Greek word that's in there that's not actually carpenter. And so what we have here are implications and insinuations and suggestions and hints about Jesus being a carpenter. So there are allusions, a little bit of innuendo going on here, some inference. And so that makes people come away from it with a belief that Jesus was a carpenter. However, there are no significant narratives in the scripture about Jesus actually performing as a carpenter, actually building something significant in this role of carpenter. But what is essentially being inferred or hinted at is that Jesus was a Rob Mog, okay? And so that's what this is really hinting at. This is what is being suggested. And so you will see people pull this out in order to have a gotcha moment related to the character of Jesus. And so we've already been talking about Rob Mog, and we're going to look at this a little bit further with respect to this carpenter insinuation. Now, before we look at this, I want to point out that being a carpenter is actually an honorable and necessary profession. However, with respect to the symbolism and the innuendo that's going on with this situation, there's a little bit more going on here than just an honorable profession. And so when someone is using the term carpenter, going back to the Latin and even looking at this construct in the Greek, what is being suggested is this idea of artifice. And so that's a part of the root of this. And artifice, even though it suggests the making of something, an artificer, okay, is an individual who, according to definition, is a trickster. Okay, so it's someone who is involved in deception, creating things, fabricating things. And so you can see how those constructs all kind of hang together. But that's a part of what is being implied by referring to Jesus as a carpenter, particularly since that's not what he was according to Scripture. You don't see that definitive statement there. Now, why would anyone want to paint Jesus as a trickster or as a son of Jacob? And so when we look at Oxford Languages, we see artifice again and it indicates clever or cunning devices. This is related to tricking and deceiving other people. And so creating deception, being beguiling, okay, cheating someone, being devious, being involved in trickery. Now, this is when it gets interesting because what we find is the word that is actually in the Greek that is used in this question about Jesus being a carpenter, it's not the word for carpenter. It is this word tectone. So when you think about tectone, think about technology. So that's a part of the root of technology. But it indicates here that this tectone, and this is at Strong's 5045, that this tectone refers to a craftsman or a carpenter. This is important because that craftsman part is what is going on here in terms of the real insinuation. And here you also see a Hebrew corresponding entry, which is karash. And again, this refers to craftsman, artisan, engraver, or carpenter, according to this. However, tectone is its own thing, and we're going to look at what that's all about. And here we have this construct of tectone or tech in the word architect. And so looking at the etymology of architect, we see that it relates to a person who is skilled at building things. Okay? It indicates a master builder or a director of works. Now, if you recall what a Rob Mog is, that Rob part relates to a great one, okay, a large one, a master one. Okay, so architect also refers to the idea of a chief, and so the chief builder. There is also rhetoric in scripture related to Jesus being related to a stone. Okay. And so if you go down further, you will see that there is a relationship between architect, tectone, and archon. It goes on to indicate that this text is related to the construct of to weave and to fabricate. And here you see this idea of one who plans or contrives. And most important, you see coming from the Old English, this idea of a high crafter. Again, this is a Rob Mog definition. And now for your special revelation. So what is a tectone? What was insinuated in Matthew and what was insinuated in Mark when referring to Jesus as a carpenter? Well, the real word was tectone. And when you translate tectone, you come away with not carpenter, but mason, a bricklayer. And so when you look at the actual Greek language that's used before you get to the English, what you have in that passage is this not the mason's son? Okay. So instead of carpenter. And then the other passage says, is this not the mason? Okay. And so that's what we have in the Greek. We do not have a carpenter. And here you have some additional Greek translations. And one entry is, the mason's son is not, or the mason's son no. And so again, that's that sort of questioning with the use of that negation. And here you can see that translation again with, isn't this the mason's son? So again, it does not say the word carpenter. However, it would be interesting to see if there might be a translation out there somewhere that used this language. And here you can see that again with this tectone indicating, is not this the mason? And for clarity, you can see it here enlarged. And just so that we are clear, we looked at the transliterations. And so we looked at all of the versions of this tectone, and what came out was repeatedly Mason, Mason, Masons, Mason. Okay. So it was repeated. There also is another transliteration at the bottom, and we will get into that. And here you can see it goes on and on and on with this tectone and mason. And then there are those two entries at the bottom that we are going to address that are related. And so at the bottom, you should note that it indicates mason, mason, mason builders, mason, 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 on and on there. But then at the end, it's telmon or talmon. And so again, we have these implied correlations going on. And so the suggestion by even having that there is that there's some relationship between Jesus and this construct of Talmon. And so it indicates here, and this is in the Hebrew, that this is derived from an unused root meaning to oppress or to cover. Now, both of these are important. That to cover is particularly noteworthy. And so what we also see here by association is this attempt to correlate Jesus and this idea of not only oppressive, but a temple doorkeeper. And so a talmon is a temple doorkeeper. And here you can see this more clearly at Strong's H2929. Now, there is very little written about this construct of Talmon, and so it is actually something that is apparently covered. And so it indicates here again that Talmon suggests oppressor, or it equals oppressor. And this is related to the head of a family of doorkeepers in the temple. Some of his descendants returned from exile with Zerubbabel and were employed in their hereditary office in the days of Nehemiah and Ezra. And so, of course, another phrase for doorkeeper is gatekeeper. Okay. And so, again, this is pointing you right back to this Rob Mog construct. And there are a number of dynamics in Scripture that offer these sorts of insinuations about Jesus potentially being a Rob Mog. And then, of course, associating Jesus with Babylon. Okay. So this is not accidental. This is not something you could do accidentally here. Okay, so we go back to Rob Mog, and that is at 7248 Strongs. And this is just a reminder that the Rob Mog is chief of the Magi. This is the chief magician, okay? The big magician, the great magician, the great sorcerer. Now, these translators and these editors certainly have had their work cut out for them. One thing that's interesting to note about this construct of Rob Mog, or this suggestion or insinuation that Jesus was involved with the Rob Mog, or that he was a Rob Mog, is that there is an entry also in Matthew. So it's Matthew 23:8. And in this entry, Jesus, the entity known as Jesus, is indicating what you should not call people. Okay. And so one of the things that is mentioned is that no man should be called rabbi. No man should be called master. And so it's very interesting that when you look at royalty and you look at nobility, um, these are constructs that are frequently used historically: master, lord, chief, those sorts of things. And so if you look at Matthew 23, 8 through 12, you'll get a better idea of what is being conveyed. But what is clearly being conveyed is there is no thought that it's a good thing to refer to anyone as a Rob. It's not suggested that it's a good thing to refer to anyone as master. In fact, quite the contrary. But again, the translators and the editors have had their work cut out for them with respect to trying to make things hang together with consistency. And this little wordsmithing lexicon game serves as yet another reason why you need to read things for yourself. You need to research for yourself. You need to analyze things for yourself. You need to do your own exegesis if you are reading scripture. You need to make sure that things say what people are telling you they say, and you need to see it for yourself. You cannot depend on other people to analyze everything for you. And I am talking about pastors. I am talking about priests. I'm talking about all of the clergy that might be teaching you. It's important for you to go behind the lesson and make sure that you understand exactly what is being communicated, what is being stated. And it's important for you to the best of your ability, find out what was said in the original language, what was really going on, and then analyze that for yourself. Again, it's great to get information from other people. It might be very convenient, but it's going to be important for you to get the information for yourself and to double check things. For instance, you had two scripture references provided. You might want to go back and make sure that those references actually say exactly what was presented. I know it might sound like a mundane, tedious thing to do every time someone presents something like that, but it is important that you get in the practice of double checking when it comes to these things.